For decades, international trade has been thriving under a rules-based system, securing to a large extent stability and predictability in trade and investment relations. While bilateral and regional trade agreements played an important role in expanding trade and investment opportunities, the main guarantor of stability and predictability has been the multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core. Since the beginning of 2025, that order has been shaken to an unprecedented level of uncertainty. Unilateral trade restrictive measures, disregarding multilateral rules, have been on the rise with ever-increasing levels of tension between trading partners. The US has expanded tariffs across a wide range of countries, with rates reaching as high as 50%, reflecting the broad and persistent scope of Trump's protectionist trade policy. The whole world is affected by Trump's action. Tariffs' impact on countries differs depending on their level of trade with the US and the nature of their exported products. The trade tensions between the United States and China have grown tougher, marked by rising tariffs from both sides and an uncertain future for their most recent agreement. Surprisingly, despite the ongoing trade war between the US and China, marked by repeated tariff hikes, China ranks only 17th among the countries most affected by these US tariffs. In the early 2025, the World Trade Policy Uncertainty Index hit record highs, driving up business costs from rerouted shipments and stockpiling, with small exporters and developing economies hit hardest due to limited financial and logistical resilience. At the same time, recent events have resurrected among the majority of trading nations, as well as the global business community, a renewed appreciation of how indispensable a rules-based system is for the prosperity of the global economy, and, conversely, how costly it is to lose it. The session gathers trade policymakers and experts to examine how recent tariff shocks and rising uncertainty are reshaping global trade. It explores the erosion of predictability, the future of the World Trade Organization, and the growing link between trade and investment policies in a fragmented global economy. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to have you all back. We'll now begin session 5 on the international trade policy in a severely disrupted world, threats to necessary predictability and stability for investment decisions. It will be moderated by Abdel Hamid Mamdouh, Senior Counsel of King & Spalding LLP at the Geneva office, and former Director of Trade and Services and Investments in the World Trade Organization. Our speakers today are Ambassador Wolff, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, via recorded message. Dr. Stefan Schepers, Executive Director and Independent High-Level Groups for EU Policy Innovation. Valerie, Picard, Head of Trade at the International Chamber of Commerce. Dr. Simon J. Evenett, Professor of Geopolitics and Strategy at the IMD Business School in Switzerland, via Zoom. His Excellency, Waleid Eldien, Chairman of the Suez Canal Economic Zone. And on behalf of His Excellency, Hassan al-Khatib, Egyptian Minister of Investment and Foreign Trade, we have Mr. Mohamed Gawsaky, the Assistant to the Egyptian Minister of Investment and Foreign Trade. Thank you all. For decades, international trade has been thriving under a rules-based system, securing to a large extent stability and predictability in trade and investment relations. While bilateral and regional trade agreements played an important role in expanding trade and investment opportunities, the main guarantor of stability and predictability has been the multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core. Since the beginning of 2025, that order has been shaken to an unprecedented level of uncertainty. Unilateral trade restrictive measures, disregarding multilateral rules, have been on the rise with ever-increasing levels of tension between trading partners. The US has expanded tariffs across a wide range of countries, with rates reaching as high as 50%, reflecting the broad and persistent scope of Trump's protectionist trade policy. The whole world is affected by Trump's action. Tariffs' impact on countries differs depending on their level of trade with the US and the nature of their exported products. The trade tensions between the United States and China have grown tougher, marked by rising tariffs from both sides and an uncertain future for their most recent agreement. Surprisingly, despite the ongoing trade war between the US and China, marked by repeated tariff hikes, China ranks only 17th among the countries most affected by these US tariffs. In the early 2025, the World Trade Policy Uncertainty Index hit record highs, driving up business costs from rerouted shipments and stockpiling, with small exporters and developing economies hit hardest due to limited financial and logistical resilience. At the same time, recent events have resurrected among the majority of trading nations, as well as the global business community, a renewed appreciation of how indispensable a rules-based system is for the prosperity of the global economy, and, conversely, how costly it is to lose it. The session gathers trade policymakers and experts to examine how recent tariff shocks and rising uncertainty are reshaping global trade. It explores the erosion of predictability, the future of the World Trade Organization, and the growing link between trade and investment policies in a fragmented global economy.
Good morning, everyone. We're starting the day with this session, which I'm happy to start with today because you're still fresh and there's a lot to unpack here. But allow me to suggest an organizational adjustment to the order of speakers, because we have Professor Simon Evenett, who will join us by Zoom, and he can only join us for a few minutes. So let's start with Simon. Simon actually has the power of facts, because he oversees the Global Trade Alert, which actually monitors what's happening on an international trade front on a daily basis. So Simon will give us a snapshot of the factual picture as it is today. Good morning, Simon, and thank you for joining us. Please go ahead. Hang on a second. Are you muted? Because we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, okay. I have exactly 4 minutes before my next appointment. So what I suggest we do, Hamid, is the following. I summarize the thesis. I've emailed you my speech, and feel free to circulate it with others. So the first point I wanted to make is, yes, we have seen a structural break in US trade policy this year. I don't think I need to belabor this point. The video that you showed the reciprocal tariff regime, amongst other factors the United States is engaged in. I think the key question to ask is, what is really driving this? And there, the thesis that I have in the short speech I was going to give is that essentially the United States has prioritized security considerations over commercial considerations in the redesign of its trade policy. We should not be surprised by this. In the paper, I described the 3 regimes of US trade policy since since 1945. The first regime up between then and the creation of the GATT and to the end of the Cold War involved the United States essentially creating a trade regime with allies and restricting the liberalization to those allies. So membership was restricted largely, and liberalization was restricted. Of course, there are wrinkles. Poland joins the GATT in 1967 and is, of course, a member of the Warsaw Pact. But in the broad scheme of things, from 1945 or 1947 through to 1989, the United States subordinated trade policy to its security objectives. And those security objectives were reinforced by open trade because the US wanted its allies to be able to grow and to be able to afford money to spend on defense. So this essentially linked trade and security in ways which were evident at the time. Once we get beyond the end of the Cold War, then we see the United States sees itself as primus inter pares. There's no competitor anywhere on the scene, and so takes a more generous attitude. Security considerations fall away and commercial considerations dominate. And this is the phase we have until about 10 years ago. During that phase, of course, we see efficiency driving the reallocation of capital. We see supply chains developing, all facilitated by information communication technology, as my colleague Richard Baldwin describes this, the so-called second unbundling. The principal, or not the principal, an important beneficiary of those changes was China. And China, of course, then grows very quickly and becomes and returns to the central place in the world trading system that it has always had before 1820. The third phase is when the United States wakes up and sees that, or assesses that it faces for the third time in its primacy in the world economy, a threat. The first threat was from the Soviet Union. The second threat was from Japan in the 70s and 80s. And now it faces the third threat. And the US sees China as a threat to its economic, military, and technological dominance. The US worries about weaponization of commodities, continuity of supply being disrupted in electronic goods. It worries about the growth of China trade growth leading to economic growth and leading to higher military spending. And lastly, the US worries about losing the battle for the technologies of the 21st century. And so for all of these reasons, the US is now subordinating its trade policy to its security imperatives. And this means essentially going back to a model of restricting access to the United States based on alliances or on affinity with the US's objectives. And this is what takes us to the current day. It, of course, emasculates many of the principles of the trading system that we have become used to and which we celebrate and adore. But essentially, this is the direction of travel. And I think ultimately the questions this raises obviously are ones to, for the countries, for countries other than China and the United States, where do we all stand? There are a large number of countries which benefit from this system, which are too small to be able to live on, to maintain their living standards based solely on domestic trade. They need international trade. And then the question really will be, how large is that bloc? And can it stick together and preserve and protect many of the principles that we have found to be so effective since the WTO was created? But essentially, security is back, Hamid. The US has put it back at the core of its approach. Arguably, some people would argue China has done the same. And there's some truth to that. And the trading system is therefore adjusting back to an era where security considerations dominate. If anything, it's back to the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for joining us. I know how tight your time is this morning, but thank you very much, and certainly also for the material you have provided. Now, I would suggest that we register from what Simon said three points here, which are going to stay with us for this conversation. The first is the old order that we are used to is falling apart. And it's falling apart at a time when there is no alternative emerging. So we are facing a messy period of vacuum. The second point is, from what Simon said also, is that we're witnessing a change, which means that we're not going to go back to how things were. This is a direction of travel, as Simon put it, so we cannot imagine that we will go back to where we were a few years ago. And the third and last point here is that what we are witnessing is structural changes. And when we have a structural problem, we will need structural solutions. Now, hang on to that thought about structural solutions, because this, I think, would be relevant to the rest of the discussion. Now, moving on to our next speaker, also we're sorry that Ambassador Alan Wolff was not able to join us. He is in Washington, D.C. now, but he has recorded a video message for us, and Alan is going to give us a bit of the U.S. perspective, not from the US administration's point of view necessarily, but from a long-standing authoritative expert in the field. So can we please start Ambassador Wolff's video?
Of my panel, Hamid Mamdouh, the highly experienced Dr. Stefan Schepers, and Ms. Valerie Picard of the ICC, bringing respectively their points of view from Europe, from the private sector, to the discussion today. First, what I want to cover is what's to be expected from the United States. The United States has cast aside its major trade obligations under international agreements, under the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade, and the WTO and its agreements. It primarily has jettisoned its commitment to live up to contractually committed tariff levels and most favored nation treatment, non-discriminatory treatment, in favor of unilateral tariffs, unilaterally applied, and bilateral agreements, deals it's reached. The predictability and stability provided by the multilateral trading system for a very sizable part of world trade for these last 80 years is vitally important to the world of trade, however, and it should be kept in mind that the United States only accounts for 13% of world trade. So it isn't applying the rules, the primary rules, but the others are. That's 87% of the world trade is still adhering to the rules that existed at the beginning of this year, before the Trump administration took office. So the fact that America's major trading partners have concluded deals with the United States has tended to ratify the new U.S. regime with respect to its trade with Washington. And this started with the UK and then followed by the European Union and Japan and others, which covers a lot of trade. So what do we expect? Continued unpredictability from Washington, but a fair degree of predictability from the rest of the world. So what steps should be taken now to improve the effectiveness of the WTO? It would be, as I said, a thoroughly self-defeating and a step in the wrong direction to simply ostracize the United States, to make the World Trade Organization into some sort of second-class organization with a second-class citizen, if it were assigned to the U.S. There's no room for second-class citizenship for the United States at the WTO, really, not as a practical matter, in my view. A WTO without the World Trade Organization, without the United States, would be setting the WTO potentially on the path to irrelevance like the League of Nations in prior times. There are important things to be dealt with at the WTO, and the United States has a clear interest in them, as do others. Standards, product standards, sanitary and phytosanitary standards. Tariffs can impede trade, that's for sure. We're seeing that happening, and world trade growth is likely to be diminished by the tariffs the U.S. is putting into place. But a standard can prevent trade altogether in a particular product. We've seen it happen with beef hormones. We've seen it happen with genetically modified organisms. We've seen it happening with the EU Green Deal threatening to cut off trade in certain products. For the foreseeable future, it's highly unlikely that there will be a means of putting new agreements in place as a formal matter. And it's not worth the energy to attempt to do it, in my view. Nor is the effort worthwhile to continue in the near term to continue under the formal heading of WTO reform. It's not going anyplace. There is no consensus in the way that term is used by the rest of the world. There's no common feeling as to what should be, how not only what should be addressed, but how the issue should be addressed. What would I have the WTO do? Guarantee transparency to the maximum extent possible. What's that mean? The Secretariat has the capability of putting on the record for all 166 countries what trade measures have been taken in this very unstable times. There should be a standing trade policy review, a TPR, on current trade deals and other distorting measures that are taking place in the world trading system. So transparency, number one. Deliberation. Those who wish to participate in plurilateral agreements that are consistent with the purposes of the Articles of Agreement of the Marrakesh Agreement should be free to do so. Pragmatism, which characterized the GATT era, should be restored. Third, dispute settlement. Dispute settlement should be binding as a condition for any country seeking to utilize the dispute settlement system. What I mean by binding, it's a final result. It doesn't get appealed into the void. It doesn't get shelved. If you, a condition of using dispute settlement is if you go in and you refuse to take an answer that you don't like, that's default. You lose. You don't have to litigate the whole thing. You've lost at the outset. Otherwise, you either join the multi-party interim agreement, the MPIIE, or some other means of making a finding binding and formally settled. Organization of the members. The institution needs to organize itself to get things done so that they can deal with climate change, with food security, with future pandemics. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, they have boards of executive directors. You don't try to get 166 or 199 countries in a room in one of those organizations and try to get anything done. You can't do it with each person taking the floor for 3 minutes. That is no way to run an organization. A committee of the whole cannot administer effectively the rules of the world trading system. So yes, there was once a consultative group of 18. There could be some other format, but the members have to organize themselves to get the job done that they've been assigned. Fifth, I should say, the fully functioning executive. The Director General should be expected to suggest the agenda for the board meetings of the boards of executive directors. They should chair the meetings of that executive board and represent the interests of not only the largest members, but they have to represent the largest members, but also the membership as a whole. A WTO working party should be formed, this is my last point, to consider how to receive the expert input into the WTO from business, from industry and agriculture, from labor, from those concerned with economic development, from those concerned with the environment, to those concerned with threats to world health, and subjects of major interest. How does that information get into the WTO system in an effective way? It probably has to be organized at the member level, at the national level in most cases, because the EU is one nation, we hope, for these purposes. If you look at Section 135, I think it is, of the Trade Act of 1974, the U.S. Congress forced on the executive branch of the United States an advisory committee system and funneling information in from all sectors of the economy and from public interest groups into the negotiating process. It's what every country needs. They don't all have to do it, but it is the best way of getting something to the governments, and they will come, the governments and authorities will come to Geneva and speak to the issues in the WTO. It's true that a lot of progress is going to take place outside of the WTO in regional agreements, and there will be plurilateral agreements. Cecilia Malmström, former EU Trade Commissioner, has suggested that the plurilaterals should be global plurilaterals. That sounds like an oxymoron. It isn't. What it means is that the plurilaterals agreements should be drafted with an eye on everyone joining if they wish to, every country joining if it wishes to, and ultimately having a multilateral agreement that includes all. So draft a plurilateral agreement with the idea that it will be global. What can be done at Cameroon in the upcoming ministerial meeting in early next year? Hamid Mamdouh has suggested, and the ICC has suggested, and I agree with this, that an agreed outcome document should be reached, stating common purpose and a rededication of international cooperation to international cooperation with agreed steps to the extent possible of what would otherwise be just a statement of high principle, agreed steps as to how to implement that document on the common purpose and rededication to international cooperation. Conclusion, during the hegemony and active leadership of the United States, who combined with a few like-minded created the world trading system that has resulted in world economic growth and well-being, unprecedented in human history. Yes, it had its flaws. It did not take into account fully other societal objectives. That should not obscure the fact that allowing what Adam Smith saw as good practice, namely opening markets to allow specialization in what economies could do best, industries could do best, would provide maximum benefits, global benefits. Efficiency is a central criterion, central objective, but the efficiency has to be tempered as a goal with other societal needs. It's true that we've learned a hard lesson that a rising tide does not lift all boats. It doesn't. But a stagnant pond lifts no boats. The way forward lies with greater international cooperation, not less. Thank you very much. Good to be with you. Wish you well in the rest of this meeting.
Well, that's the end of our video messaging, and we turn now to our speakers so that we can more agree or disagree in person with what we hear. And according to, going back to our order of speaking, I will invite Professor Stefan Schepers to give us his perspective from his think tank views, but also from an EU perspective with respect to the kind of chaotic situation that the trading system is facing today. Stefan, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important conference. I can bring you some hope because thinking in Brussels is slowly changing. Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazabi. Do you remember these great Arab Muslim scientists from the 12th century who stood at the beginning of the European Renaissance? Europeans are rediscovering that the West was made also by the rest. This is an important point to keep in mind when we discuss the great disruption caused in the last few years. This has been going on much longer because in the last couple of decades, the West has lost its research monopoly. And research is the basis of technology development. Technology development leads to new products and services, which are the basis of trade. And trade is the key instrument to share technology advance turned into tangible products or services, is the key instrument to develop welfare for the people. The second idea, which Brussels is more and more acutely aware of, as Ambassador Wolff rightly said, 87% of trade is not American trade, is done by the rest. And in that context, Europe and China play an important role. And the rest, forgive me and calling it this way, should play also an increasingly important role. How the American government is at the moment not just disrupting trade, it is also disrupting what I talked about, research cooperation. I know of several leading European research institutions in Europe which received visits from American diplomats telling them not to cooperate with that other research powerhouse, China. This is important. Research, production, trade are linked. This is also why the European Union, in its trade agreements, has been adding for years a research component. I think they could be better. I think it could be different, but the basic idea is there. Now, what can we expect in these times from Brussels? A rule-based order, ladies and gentlemen, is now in the European DNA. Because the European Union itself was the first rule-based order built after 1947, before GATT and before WTO. And we know how much this has helped our economic growth and how much this has developed. This has helped to build the rich welfare states which Europe now enjoys. A second strength, besides research and economic productivity and welfare, is that, and we should not overlook this, Europe has a very favorable Gini coefficient, contrary to the United States, which have a very negative Gini coefficient. The gap between the rich and the poor is an important element in social stability. Social stability creates political stability. Political stability creates investment stability. Everything is linked. So, what can we expect from Brussels? There was an event last year already, organized by the very powerful Directorate General for Trade at the European Commission, where we discussed how to deconstruct Eurocentrism, the way of thinking the world through European lenses. So in various ways, there is a new kind of cosmopolitan thinking arising in Europe. And that's the basis for new thinking about trade. We are not yet there. We still have years to struggle to change our thinking. And it's only when we change our thinking that we can change our practices. But we have started. And the rest of the world should help the Europeans. And they don't. The rest of the world doesn't really consider how complex the system of European policy making is. And they deal with us as if we were a single state. We aren't. We are a union of 27. Just a very simple, concrete example. Most of the world's countries have no coordination mechanism between their embassy in Brussels and their embassies in the 27 member states. But if you don't have a parallel policy-making system as the Europeans have themselves, you're missing out on the action. That would perhaps be a very urgent measure, improvement to make. And it would help to reduce, in particular, the extraterritorialism and the protectionist thinking, which is still prevalent in Brussels, and particularly strong under the Green Deal. CBAM, EUDR, you all know it. It was not necessarily ill intentions. It was just lack of global cooperation which led Brussels to these ill-conceived regulations, which they are now reviewing. We have a problem also, because we are not a state, we are a union. We are a mini WTO. And inside the European Commission, between the European Commission and the member governments, there are many fault lines. We are also a quite open system, where there is a real role in the policy preparation phase for business, for research and think tank centers, and if they would be playing a proper role also for third countries. We have one short-term problem, which is called Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is for Europe an existential threat. And this means that Europe finds itself at the moment in a position of being easily blackmailed by its former ally. People realize that, but it came also suddenly. We don't know what to do. Our own defense system has been neglected for years because Europeans have believed in eternal peace as they created it in Europe, and as they hoped that a rule of law would be extended to the rest of the world. What does this mean for European trade in future? We launched, or think tanks launched, and the European Commission and governments took it over, the concept of partnerships. The traditional trade agreements should be widened into partnership agreements, whereby we take a much more comprehensive approach. What we should bring back in the trade debates is the Kaldor-Hicks paradigm from the 1930s, forgotten, but applied in Europe. The European market integration process had solid mechanisms to deal with the losers. And that's something we should have at a global level. And what the Europeans in their partnership contexts will introduce. Hence the importance of a research part, hence the importance of cooperation with the key challenges of today, which is inequality and which is climate change. So there is hope.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you for sticking to the 10 minutes. Stefan raised essential points for our conversation today, particularly those that relate to leadership and the potential role that the EU can play as a trading power, not only in terms of the trade weight, but when we talk about leadership, I think we also mean thought leadership, not just the political weight or the share in trade. And there, I think the EU has a lot to offer. There is a lot to unpack in what he said, but moving on to our next speaker, Valerie Picard, this is actually a perspective that is particularly critical for our conversation today. Valerie is speaking on behalf of the ICC, which represents the global business community as represented by the International Chamber of Commerce. And we all know that the business community are actually the end users of the disciplines and the system that we have. So in this kind of tumultuous time, we want to hear what the view of the business community is. Valerie, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And I also wanted to thank, of course, the organizers. And thinking, of course, on a personal note, it's my first time in Egypt. So what a wonderful place to have a conversation about trade, because Cairo and Egypt have been, you know, connecting regions and markets and ideas for, I was going to say centuries, but it's millennia, you know. So really an amazing place to have this conversation. So thank you. And indeed, in terms of where, coming back to Hamid's question and what we're here to discuss is, what has the global business community been living through? What are we seeing? And really, where are we seeing the key challenges? And of course, what needs to be done from our perspective to help move things forward and to get back to what I would call a positive, forward-looking trade agenda? I think in terms of where we are from the perspective of the global business community, and we're now in November, so I don't think it's too early to call this, but this has really been a year unlike any other in recent memory. And of course, there has been the shock from the United States at the start of the year, the reciprocal tariffs, and a lot of attention has been understandably spent on that, and of course, the bilateral discussions. And from the business perspective, the ensuing uncertainty, I think if we all see from the headlines, has just been really navigating in the dark and not knowing which way things are going. And, you know, as we always say, not doing anything is not a business strategy. So the immobilization is really hurting. But I wanted to note, and I think it's important, it's not just the United States that businesses from trading across borders are facing. And it's not new. You know, this is, I think Simon already started with this, but this started, we've been seeing, and ICC has been talking about this for a long time, is the rising trade barriers, the rising protectionism. And really what we just saw this year in extent was sort of at the apex of this, and that we can no longer ignore it. And so it's not coming only from the US, but traders are facing tariff and non-tariff barriers across the world. You know, it was one of our members said to me, you know, said, Valerie, it's, you know, trying to figure out new tariff codes while also preparing for CBAM, which comes into implementation and at the start of next year, is like trying to change the tire on a moving car. And I think we know where that's going to end. So the question we're asking ourselves is, of course we know that business is going to adapt, business is going to still trade, but the question is, at what cost and who's going to be left standing? at the end of all of this if we don't sort of, in a very urgent way, really start to address these issues. And so, you know, from an IC perspective, Hamid mentioned it, ICC, we're the institutional representative of 45 million businesses in over 170 countries. 70% of our membership is in developing economies, so we see business across the world, but also our, we were founded in 1919 out of the ashes of the First World War when traders, a few traders got together and said, there are no rules for international trade. We need rules because this will help, of course, contribute to economic prosperity and ultimately peace. And they called themselves the Merchants of Peace. And that remains in our DNA today. And here we are talking again about a rules-based international trading system and the importance of rules. And so we're coming back to first principles. And if anything we've seen this year, and I think, is that we need the rules. And I think there's that, at least there's been that acknowledgement this year. And we, as I see, we looked and we said, okay, let's look and see what would happen today if there were no World Trade Organization. What would that mean for developing economies? And we commissioned an independent study from Oxford Economics, and the results were extremely stark. For developing economies across the board, it would mean a 33% drop in non-fuel goods exports and a permanent hit to GDP of 5%. That's enormous. So the welfare benefits of the World Trade Organization and the multilateral trading system should not be underappreciated. And we actually did a follow-up study where we wanted to do a deeper dive looking at 10 developing economies. And we chose a selection because to have different markets, different sizes, different places, and we looked at, I always forget a few, but India, South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey, Guatemala, China, Brazil, and also Egypt. And what we found was the results were consistent with our regional study that we had done. And incidentally, of course, for Africa, it would be among the hardest hit with above 40% hit to exports. For Egypt, the good news is that you were of the 10 economies we looked at, among the least impacted. But the bad news was even least impacted was still very impacted, around 20% for exports and a 3% hit to GDP. So we wanted to use these numbers just to remind ourselves what's at stake. And I can't remember, maybe it was Alan who said, the system is not perfect. It needs to be improved, and we recognize that, but it is critical. So with that in mind, with this, you know, what do we from the global business community want to see at the next ministerial? Because we see there is an opportunity coming up when ministers get together in Yaoundé at the end of March to discuss the pressing issues facing the World Trade Organization. And we've kept our asks or are very targeted because we do realize sort of the complexity of the current environment. And what we're asking for is the launch of a reform round, and we can call it what you want, but what we're looking for is, can there finally be structured, time-bound discussions, even among a subset of members, because we realize that consensus will be elusive among 166 members. And in particular, and Alan sort of alluded to this, there's this need to address threshold issues around consensus, around plurilaterals, around special and differential treatment. So and if those can be addressed, our view is then we can unlock the negotiating function and get to what business really wants is an updated rule book so that it can address really critical issues like digital trade, like trade and sustainability, but also things like subsidies, which cannot be addressed bilaterally. So those need to be looked at on a multilateral level because there's just no point if only 2 countries address it. You know, we're not going to solve the problem. But we also recognize, and I think this is important, that we're no longer, I think to come back to the start of the discussion where I think it was Hamid who said, you know, we're not going backwards, and we're in a new era. And in this new era, the model of 1995 does not fit 2025. So we as the business community, we're pragmatic, we know this. So we also recognize that one-size-fit model today won't necessarily work, and we need to introduce more flexibility. It doesn't mean à la carte, you know, as they say in French, but it means just enough flexibility so that to keep all the members at the table. And the metaphor that I like to use when I think about this is, you know, at the moment, you know, as I alluded to, businesses are facing we're in a tsunami. You know, it's a perfect storm, 2025, with just so many pressures on businesses, and I mentioned it wasn't just tariffs and all of this. But if you look at and this is true whether it's a business or whether it's a system, if you think about a storm, and it's the old trees with the very thick trunks that end up, when the storm is over and they've all, they're lying on the ground and they've broken. But it's the trees that have a little bit of flexibility, but remain rooted. I think that's quite important, that survive the storm. So that's the image that I have in mind. So can we introduce the flexibilities needed to save the system, essentially? And we do recognize it's not easy. I think we need to be pragmatic, but business is really willing to step up. Am I at time and you're looking at me? I am going to wrap up. Business is really wants to be there, part of the reform process, and also critically as an outcome, because I think that's one of the weaknesses, that we're not able to, in a structured way, engage in all the technical work happening. And I'll just also end, of course, with the importance of renewing the moratorium as part of this discussion. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Hamid before he grabs the mic from me.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie. A few terribly important points here. I think the crucial importance of predictability and stability for the business community, because this is how you take your investment decisions. And it's interesting what you said about the study that was done by Oxford Economics about what would happen if the WTO collapses. And it's interesting what you said about the case of Egypt. The estimate is 20% loss in exports and about 3% loss in GDP. This is quite substantial. And I think this actually illustrates the point of how we have been taking the rules-based multilateral trading system for granted. Just because it was functioning, everything was okay. But now, maybe Trump has done the system a favor by providing this shock that would be a wake-up call for those who really care about a rules-based system. But it's also interesting what you said, Valerie, about the US is not the only culprit in this situation. The WTO has been facing tremendous challenges. The WTO has been in trouble for quite some time. For the past almost 10 years, the leaders of the G20 have been calling for necessary reform for the WTO. So it is not new, and there are other culprits in the system. And the diversity among membership is causing chaos. And that's what I referred to in the beginning as structural problems. And we need to start constructing a vision about what is the new system and what should it look like. And your point, Valerie, about the next ministerial in March being an opportunity to adopt an agenda is exactly where the vision, I think, should be constructed now, or at least an effort towards that. Well, moving on, our next speaker, of course, is His Excellency Mr. Waleid Gamal, who is the chairman of the Suez Canal Special Economic Zone. And thank you for being with us today. And we would want to hear from you, your perspective about the subject that we're discussing. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here today. In the first part of my speech, I'll speak as a financial economist, not as the chairman of the Suez Canal Economic Zone. I believe what happened, the ripple effect that happened the last 9 months or 10 months is unprecedented and will not be recovered. And already it set in motion a few things that will change how investments and trade worldwide works. So let's get a few numbers. I'm a guy that likes numbers. So the GDP of the US is 30 billion on average, of which 80% is services. Manufacturing, 18.4. So 18.4 from 30 billion is around 30 trillion is around $5.4 trillion for manufacturing. If you remove arms, military, which is around 3.5%, you go down from 18.4 to 14 point something. Let's say 14.5. That's around $4.4 trillion of manufacturing goods. Is that sizable? It's quite sizable. You can add 100 emerging countries together and you still don't get that figure. So the US did a unilateral decision that hurted itself first and its people before anyone else. Why? Manufacturing is all about cost and efficiencies, no matter how you play the game. So whatever industries remained in the US will continue to remain, and whatever they want to bring back home, America first, will be very marginal. So 4.4 becomes 5, 5.5 again, add another trillion, against what price? A weaker currency that already depreciated by 10 to 12% at the beginning of the year. You push central banks around the world to the first time look at gold as a reserve and going back to the gold standard without having to do anything, without having to get others on board for no reason. You did another drastic effect, which you made the EU non-competitive more than it already is, by making the euro appreciate by the similar percentage for no reason. We already have enough problems on their own, and they're reactive, not proactive. The purchasing power in the US for the people decreased, inflation increasing, crippling in the economy. So will the central bank decrease again? I don't think so. Lower interest, lower inflation. I don't see inflation will go down. It's similar to what happened in the COVID times. Zero cost of funding, interruption in manufacturing worldwide, hesitation by the investment community to invest till they see this COVID is finishing in 1 year or 2 years. So the investments were minimal. Demand outpaced production. That led to inflation. Rise of interest rate worldwide, but still you cannot control inflation. Again, investors rely on simply, and if I go to the China other side, the GDP in China is 20 trillion, 40% manufacturing. So if you compare, they're not so different. 40% of 20 is similar to 20% of 30. Almost the same. The difference is other countries started to move out of their home knowing that their costs and efficiencies are no longer there. They need to move emerging countries that have better cost of labor, skilled, like Egypt, better energy costs, proximity to markets, the phenomena of nearshoring, lesser disruption in value chain, lesser disruption in transportation cost, insurance. So when you put all this together and you say, after all this, what is the game? What is the aim? What is the real benefit? To who are we really doing all this for? Adding a GDP from 18.4 to 19, 20 at best? Against what price? So, going back to the flip side, Egypt and the Suez Canal Economic Zone is working hard to become one of the major powerhouses in manufacturing. The SE Zone, or the Suez Canal Economic Zone, in the past 3 years, and before all this disruption happened, worked heavily in making sure that we have the right infrastructure, the right ecosystem, the right labor cost, the right everything, to ensure we bring in investments. So I'll give you a small glimpse. The zone was established in 2015. The first 7 years, we attracted no more than $2 billion of investments. In the last 3.5 years, we attracted $11 billion of investments. 80% is FDI. What happened? We started 3 years ago, more than slightly 3 years ago, to ensure that we have the right elements, the right story, to bring in investments from all around the world. They knew beforehand, before this trade war happens, that it's better to move in areas with better efficiencies, and the most important word I heard today is research. This is what is destroying developed economies today. They're lacking the research that is needed for industry. So this led to, we brought a lot of investments in industries we never happened before in Egypt, and due to that, most of these industries are export-oriented. So I don't believe there's going to be any effect to our commodities exports. What we have and what increased, and we have to look at the fine prints in the trade balance of Egypt, is our energy imports increased. But our commodities increased and our imports stayed almost the same. So the gap for commodities decreased, while the energy, which is around $20 billion bill, pushed or widened our trade deficit. So I believe in the next few years, investors, some will be reluctant to invest, and some will move to markets that they feel more efficient, using their incentives, direct and indirect, to stabilize what's happening around the world. And nobody knows, honestly, what's going to happen. If anyone says no, what's going to happen? We don't. It's a very simple thing. But again, we have, as Egypt, a window of opportunity, maybe that comes once in a lifetime, in the next 24 months, to attract investors to Egypt, to use it as a base for the local market and a springboard to a neighboring market, and to differentiate us. Because at the end of the day, beyond this 10% that we were, we don't work this way, or at least the zone doesn't work with that. We don't work about a current issue in time that can change in 2-3 years' time. So what we're working on is making sure that we have the right system for the right people. I can tell you today, investors are coming to the zone, not asking me about the direct incentives, but more on the indirect incentives. Availability of skilled labor, energy costs, proximity to markets, foreign trade agreements, how to become around the Suez Canal and export both the Mediterranean and Red Sea. This is the differentiator. So again, I can ask the first question I said, why was all this for? And I don't think it can be fixed by, theoretical studies. But investors need to sit down and tell developed countries, you need to really think of what you want to do. The US wanted to bring back some industries. They should have thought a few industries, not blanket type of approach, which is now going to have a major effect on the global economy and the US economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was quite a fascinating overview, but also linking a few things and connecting a few dots, which are terribly important. I think one of the interesting things you certainly pointed at is that what we call the weaponization of trade to achieve different purposes. It's not just about attracting manufacturing operations. That's not the story. And this again links to the point that we referred to earlier about the kind of structural problem that is emerging. This is not cyclical, and therefore the solutions would have to match the magnitude of the problem. But the other thing that you also mentioned that caught my attention was the upward of investments for export-oriented industries, which immediately raises the importance of predictability and stability of trade and investment relations. And you mentioned that one of the things that you are asked about by investors is trade agreements, because it's about securing export opportunities. And that brings to the center stage the subject of our conversation here now. Anyway, without any further ado, our final speaker is Mr. Mohamed Gawsaky, Deputy Minister for Trade and Investment. He is representing Minister Hassan Al-Khatib, who unfortunately could not make it today, but Minister Al-Khatib is very well represented. I can say that. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to share this interesting discussion. But before I start, I want to thank ECS for organizing this event, and thank you, Dr. Abdel, for the welcoming spirit here, and the distinguished guests and the panelists. Again, I apologize for His Excellency Engineer Hassan Khatib for not being able to come today in this important discussion. But before I start, I would want to, not as an official government representative, but as an Egyptian, to thank Dr. Abdel again for introducing the visit to the Grand Egyptian Museum today. I think it's our pride that we finally opened the museum. It might not be the largest or the most sophisticated, but for sure it's the most honorable museum, because the 100% of 100,000 artifacts belong to the Egyptian civilization, not borrowed from somewhere else. So I would want to encourage you to enjoy the visit. It's very challenging to speak at last, especially after all the distinguished guests have spoken, but let me look at it from a little bit different perspective. I think we all agree that we are at an inflection point where things are changing. It's not a matter of the current change, but the foreseen future, which is honestly bears a lot of ambiguity. We're looking at globalization as we've seen it for the past decade is sort of fading away. And this is a fact that we have to face. Globalization that created the economies of the Far East and the Chinas of the world today is facing an existential challenge. We're looking at, not as we've seen in terms of just-in-time manufacturing and supply chain efficiency, we're looking at more changing paradigm in terms of tariffs, in terms of borders, in terms of roaring calls even to dismantle the multilateral system altogether. This on its own represents a challenge. I was fortunate last month to be in the G20 by kind invitation from the government of South Africa, and WTO reform was on the top of the agenda, because we all agree that there are some changes that has to be done, but dismantling the multilateral system altogether would be no short of, I would say, utterly detrimental consequences. So Egypt's stance is clear. We stand behind the multilateral system because this is the one chance of having a balanced and fair and competitive landscape for all. Doesn't deny the fact that there are changes that has to be done in the institutions. The settlement system within the organization, among others, has to be looked at carefully. So what we need to look at is we need less words and more deeds. We need to act, because we might think that everyone wants change, but no one wants to change. There's a very big difference between both. And as Valerie mentioned about the consequences of the tariffs, maybe Egypt is the least impacted country in terms of numbers, but it's not only about the damage that will happen to Egypt, but the damage that will happen to the ecosystem altogether. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you need to go in company. So we need to go together, because at the end of the day, it's an interrelated system. So as much as there's a challenge that stands in front of us, there's also an opportunity. Maybe Charles Darwin was right in his book, Origin of Species, when he talked about adaptation and evolution. He didn't talk about the survival of the strongest. He said the survival of the fittest. So in Egypt, we see that there's a very strong debate between the East and the West, between the unipolar, multipolar, between US and China. I think we need to diligently assess, and we need to look at the competitive advantage that today Egypt brings. So we've acted already. We've taken steps into drafting, for the first time, Egypt foreign trade policy to be put in place with the pillars and with the actions that we need to take. And we followed this policy with structural reform that has to be done on multiple layers, whether government organizations or entities that support the ecosystem altogether. We also looked at procedural changes that needs to be taken, because you cannot just dream of something that will happen in the medium and long term and you forget to acknowledge that there are gaps in the system that need to be filled, and they need to be filled urgently. Dr. Abla and the center helped us in assessing how we can, just to give you one example, how we can optimize the custom clearance time. And we had a very deliberate and objective and scientific assessment of what we started in December of last year, when we had more than 15 days of custom clearance time. Today we're at 5.8. and we're targeting 2 days before the end of the year. A single day of optimization would translate into $150 million of saving. That is the cost of inefficiency that we used to have. So again, looking at the holistic picture, there is change that is happening, and we need to acknowledge that, because change is the only constant in the universe. And you cannot shy away from acknowledging the fact that you will be impacted one way or the other. And you need to go together, and you need to work internally on what needs to be changed. And the last thing that I want to leave you with is that it might be, no, it's not might be, it's definitely easier said than done. But also, that's not a short-term thing. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We started it, and we're
very much determined to continue the path. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for giving us a quick perspective of Egypt's trade policy approach. I think from what you said, I agree with you completely. We need less words and more deeds, as you rightly said. And that makes me think of MC14, what Valerie was talking about as the next stop where opportunity might be there to actually take action. An action at MC14 actually should not be something that is too ambitious, because what you're talking about is launching an agenda. We're not talking about agreeing on solutions, but at least getting started with the way forward. And you're absolutely right. You want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, we go together. That's what I would call enlightened self-interest. This is what the US used to do way, way back, and creating this institutional architecture and infrastructure that we have that worked very well until it didn't. And now things have changed. But thank you so much for this perspective. And I think we've heard from our panelists different perspectives regarding how critical it is to have a rules-based system as opposed to a power-based system for international trade and investment. And I don't need to say, again, although I'm never tired of repeating this, when we talk about trade and investment, we're talking about more or less the same agenda. Because the reality of today's world that operates with global value and supply chains is that 2/3 of global FDI flows are defined as trade in services. So when we talk about trade policy and investment policy, we're talking about two facets of an expanded file. So there we go. And I was delighted when the new Egyptian government, although it's not new anymore, put trade and investment in the same ministry. I thought that was putting the policy-making machinery definitely on the right track. So congratulations for all that. Now we have, as I can see on the screen, 3 minutes left. Do we take questions? One question? Okay, Abdel, could you have a microphone, please? We have a question here already.
Well, thank you very much for a very insightful discussion, actually. My question here is from European point of view, how we can foster the relationship between Egypt and Europe to the next level based on innovation aspects and economic aspect, and what is the potential for something like this? How it could benefit both?
Stefan, please.
Thank you. Let me briefly outline what the EU means with its new partnership context. They definitely would like to find with their partners, and that can be one country or a coalition of countries. The idea of coalitions of the willing is very strong in Brussels. They would like to find more inclusive economic cooperation, which would address specific global and local issues. This could be, in the case of Egypt, for example, research on water scarcity and on food technology, or any other issues determined by the Egyptian government. So what the EU is considering is, in this partnership, research and technology cooperation, which benefits directly the other party in the agreement. it is considering, but does not yet know how, compensatory mechanisms for those who lose out. It's unavoidable almost that free trade has winners and losers. The EU itself has a very successful mechanisms of so-called cohesion funds for new member states, poor regions. How could we transform something of this into our partnership agreements? It has taken a very minor step in this direction by asymmetric trade agreements with African countries, but only with the LDCs. So middle-income country like Egypt can't hope for that. We may also be looking at extending expanding the MFN, the multi-framework, the favored nations. And we are putting priorities on sustainable growth and climate change. The two are linked. So this is a random approach at the moment. It's not yet ready. It's cooking in the ingredients are in the kitchen, but it's not yet served in a meal. The discussions are ongoing. The EU is suffering from, as I said, fault lines inside the Commission, between Commission and Parliament, and between the member states. Most of them at the moment have weak governments, and that really affects the capacity of the EU itself. But the debate is ongoing. The research, the think tank work, the policy institutions, they are all thinking in this direction. This is why I said there is hope.
Thank you, Stefan. I think this is an example of the kind of leadership that, or thought leadership that I was referring to before. I think we are looking now at a scenery where we need to look at what we see and see the distinction between, or the difference between exercising power and providing leadership. I mean, they're two different things. I won't expand more on that, but I think we've come to the end of this panel, and thank you very much. I feel privileged that I've had the opportunity to have such an amazing lineup of speakers. I have a message here from Abdel, please.
We have a voting system at the end of every session.
Oh, yes.
We have a question that addressed to the audience, and they provide their answer, so please put the question. And please, audience, prepare to vote. Gen Z is one group, everybody else in the other group. What is the future of the global trade order? And there are 4 choices. Stick to the existing rules-based order, WTO. This is A. Move to a stricter rules-based order, WTO as well, but it changed one. B. C. Shift to a power-based order, which is more or less where we are playing right now. D. Move towards regional blocs and trade alliances. And you have 1 minute to answer before time is up. Very interesting results. The Gen Zs do not see any hope in moving to a stricter rules-based order WTO. There is no hope in changing the WTO, and there is very little hope in sticking to the original WTO. And oh gosh, and the move towards regional blocs and trade alliances is seen by all very wisely as happening. Very interesting result, and the one that shows the most the contrast between the Gen Zs and everybody else. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. This shows how much work still needs to be done, no?